I Fell in Love with the Man Who Thought He Was a Bear by Joan Savage. Chapter 1. The Bear Man. The first thing Olivia Parker heard about Ethan Walker was that he had stopped using forks. Not because he couldn't afford them. Not because he'd lost them somewhere between the kitchen drawer and the dish rack. He'd stopped using forks because, as he'd reportedly explained to the one local who still talked to him regularly, bears don't use forks, and bears seem to be doing just fine. Olivia read that sentence 3 times sitting at her desk in the New York Tribune's open-plan office, surrounded by the particular kind of controlled chaos that smelled like cold coffee and ambition. She read it a 3rd time because she wanted to make sure she hadn't misunderstood it. She hadn't. A grown man in the mountains of Montana had voluntarily given up cutlery in solidarity with large woodland mammals. She looked up at her editor, Dennis Hartley, who was leaning against the edge of her desk with his arms crossed and the expression he always wore when he was about to ruin her week. "You want me to go to Montana?" she said. "I want you to go to Montana," he confirmed. "To interview a man who thinks he's a bear." "He doesn't think he's a bear, Liv. He thinks he should live like one. There's a philosophical distinction." "That distinction does not make me feel better about this assignment, Dennis." He picked up her coffee mug, looked into it, set it back down. The piece went viral last Tuesday. Some hiker posted a video of him on TikTok. The man was apparently crouching near a stream eating a fish with his hands while a real bear watched him from about 20 feet away. Olivia stared at him. The bear didn't attack him? Apparently the bear looked confused and then walked away. "I feel a deep spiritual kinship with that bear." Walked away. Dennis didn't smile, but his left eyebrow rose approximately 2 millimeters, which was as close as he got. "The video has 47 million views. 47 million, Olivia. People are calling him the Bear Man. Half of them think he's a genius. The other half think he needs a mental health intervention. Everyone wants to know who he is." Olivia leaned back in her chair. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind Dennis, Manhattan performed its daily spectacle of taxis, pigeons, and people walking too fast while staring at phones. She thought about the fact that she had not been outside for actual fresh air in 11 days. She thought about the deadline she'd missed last month, the apartment that needed cleaning, the plants she kept forgetting to water until they looked personally offended. She thought about Montana. "Fine," she said. "But I'm expensing everything, including the bear spray." Dennis was already walking away. "The Tribune will cover reasonable expenses." Walking away. "Bear spray is extremely reasonable in this situation." He disappeared into his office and closed the door. Olivia turned back to her computer, pulled up the TikTok video, and watched a bearded man in a flannel shirt crouch beside a Montana river and eat a trout with an expression of calm, focused dignity. She had to admit, if only to herself, that he had excellent posture for a man eating raw fish with his hands. She booked the flight that afternoon. The drive from Missoula up into the mountains took 2.5 hours on increasingly narrow roads that seemed to operate on the optimistic assumption that 2 cars could pass each other without anyone dying. Olivia's rental car, a sensible compact sedan that was already making noises she didn't recognize, crawled through pine forests so dense and green they seemed to absorb light entirely. The sky, where she could see it, was the kind of blue that cities only manage twice a year by accident. She had done her research on the plane. Only managed twice a year. Ethan Walker, 38 years old, former United States Forest Service Ranger with 9 years of service, degree in environmental science from the University of Montana. No criminal record, no social media presence, obviously. The only record of him that existed in any recent database was a property deed for 42 acres in the mountains outside a small town called Millhaven, population 840, where the primary industries appeared to be timber, tourism in the summer, and minding each other's business year-round. He'd bought the land 6 years ago. Before that, very little. A gap in the record that suggested either something had happened or he'd simply chosen to become invisible. Millhaven itself was the kind of town that looked exactly like what it was. Genuine. Not curated rustic, not Instagram charming. Not the kind of place that had been renovated to look like the old version of itself. Just actually old. To look like the old version. A main street with a diner, a hardware store, a small library with a hand-painted sign, a post office the size of a storage unit, and a bar called the Millhaven Tap that appeared to do steady business even on a Tuesday afternoon. Olivia parked in front of the diner, retrieved her recorder, her notebook, and the travel-size bear spray she'd bought in the airport gift shop in Missoula, which had seemed like a reasonable purchase until the woman behind the counter told her it was mostly decorative, and went inside. The diner was called May's. May herself turned out to be a 70-year-old woman with silver hair piled into a bun, reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular confidence of a woman who had operated her establishment so long that she considered the entire town her personal business. "You're the journalist," May said, before Olivia had opened her mouth. Olivia sat down at the counter. "Is it that obvious?" Olivia sat down. "You're carrying a recorder and a notebook, and you have the look of someone who hasn't seen mountains before." May poured her coffee without asking. "Also, Linda at the post office texted me." "Of course she did." "You're here about Ethan." "I am." May's expression shifted into something more considered. She refilled a coffee cup at the other end of the counter, came back, and leaned on her elbows. "What exactly are you planning to write about him?" Olivia wrapped her hands around the mug. The coffee was better than anything she'd had in New York in 6 months. "A human interest piece, the viral video. Who he is, what he's doing up there, what he thinks about it. And you're not going to make him look like a circus act?" The directness of it was startling enough that Olivia answered honestly. "I'm going to try not to." May studied her for a moment with the evaluating patience of someone who had seen a great many people pass through and learned to categorize them quickly. Then she straightened and said, "He comes to town on Thursdays for supplies, stays about 40 minutes, doesn't talk much, gets what he needs and leaves. He doesn't like surprises." "Today is Tuesday." "Yes, it is." May slid a laminated menu across the counter. "In the meantime, you should eat something. The chicken pot pie is good, and if you want to find Ethan Walker before Thursday, you'll need to go up the mountain, which means you'll need better shoes than those." Olivia looked down at her ankle boots. They were stylish. They were not, she was beginning to understand, Montana appropriate. "There's a general store 2 doors down," May said. "Tell Carl I sent you. He'll set you right." Olivia ordered the chicken pot pie. It was extraordinary. She bought hiking boots at Carl's general store, which were ugly and wonderful. She checked into the one inn Millhaven offered, a Victorian house run by a retired couple named Ruth and George, who gave her the room with the best view of the mountains and left a plate of homemade cookies outside her door without being asked. She stood at the window that night and looked up at the dark silhouette of the mountains against a sky so full of stars, it seemed structurally excessive. Somewhere up there, a man was presumably sleeping in a manner he considered bear-appropriate, which she could only imagine involved some kind of den situation. She should have found this absurd. She did find it absurd. She also found, to her mild surprise, that she was genuinely curious. Not in the way she was curious about most assignments, which was a professional and somewhat mechanical curiosity. This was something more personal. Something that had to do, maybe, with the fact that she'd been living in New York for 8 years and couldn't remember the last time she'd seen the sky look like this. She ate a cookie and went to bed. She dreamed about bears, which seemed inevitable. Chapter 2. The viral story. The video, if you hadn't seen it, was approximately 45 seconds long and had been filmed by a hiker named Brandon Cho, who had been attempting to photograph a particularly photogenic section of river when he'd noticed a man already crouching there. Brandon, to his credit, had stayed very still and filmed in silence because he'd assumed at first that he was watching someone in genuine distress. The man was clearly adult, clearly capable, and clearly choosing, with full, deliberate intention, to eat a fish directly from the river with his bare hands. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt. His hair was long but not unkempt. He wasn't talking to himself or behaving erratically. Long but not unkempt. He was simply eating a fish in a very specific crouch that, once you noticed it, did bear a remarkable resemblance to what an actual bear would look like doing the same thing. The real bear had appeared about 30 seconds in. It had emerged from the tree line, assessed the situation, and then stood very still in the way animals do when they're trying to decide if something is a threat or simply confusing. The man had glanced at it. The bear had looked at him. The man had gone back to his fish. The bear had watched for another 10 seconds and then walked back into the trees. The caption Brandon had written was, "I don't know what I witnessed today, but I think this man won." 47 million people had agreed. The comments divided themselves into predictable camps. There were the people who thought he was a prophet of some kind, the people who wanted to join him, the people who were concerned, the people who were making memes, and a smaller but vocal group who were debating the food safety implications of eating raw freshwater fish. Ethan Walker himself had no idea any of this was happening, which the internet found simultaneously charming and maddening. Olivia had read all 4,000 of the top comments on the plane. She'd also found 3 other pieces of footage that had surfaced in the week since. A local news clip from 2 years prior, in which a Millhaven resident mentioned offhandedly that the bear man up the mountain had helped repair the elementary school's roof after a windstorm, asking nothing in return. A grainy photograph someone had taken from a distance of a man walking through the woods beside what appeared to be, though this was disputed in the replies, an actual black bear just walking alongside him like they were on the same commute, and a brief radio interview from a Montana public radio station, recorded 3 years ago, in which Ethan Walker had calmly explained his philosophy in a voice that was low and measured and not at all what Olivia had expected. She'd listened to it 4 times. "The issue," he'd said in that measured voice, "isn't that people are unhappy," he'd said in that measured. "The issue is that they've created systems that guarantee unhappiness and then can't understand why the guarantee keeps paying out. Bears don't have those systems. Bears sleep when they need to sleep. They eat when they're hungry. They don't send emails at 11 o'clock at night. They don't pretend to like people they don't like. They exist in accordance with what they actually are." The radio host had asked gently if he was being serious. "I'm always serious," Ethan Walker had said. "I'm also usually outdoors." Olivia had paused the recording at that point and sat with it for a moment. Because the thing was, and she'd checked herself 3 times for the journalistic instinct to soften inconvenient truths. The thing was, it wasn't entirely wrong. Not the bear part specifically, but the premise underneath it. The part about systems that guaranteed unhappiness. Underneath it. She'd been at the Tribune for 6 years, and she spent a meaningful percentage of her working hours doing things that had no discernible connection to anything she actually valued. She hadn't sent that thought anywhere useful yet. She'd just filed it under things to think about later, which was a very large mental folder that she never actually opened. Now, on her second morning in Millhaven, she ate breakfast at May's, borrowed Ruth's detailed hand-drawn map of the trails up the mountain, and started walking. The trail was not difficult in the way that the word trail sometimes suggested. Not paved, not maintained, not equipped with helpful signage at regular intervals. It was a path in the sense that a path existed if you knew where to look, which Olivia increasingly did not. She had the map. She had the new boots, which were already proving their value. Map. She had her recorder and her notebook and the decorative bear spray and a water bottle and a completely reasonable degree of confidence in her ability to navigate wilderness situations, despite having never been in one before. 2 hours up the mountain, she found the cabin. She almost missed it. It was set back from the trail behind a stand of spruce trees, and it had clearly been built to look like part of the landscape rather than an interruption of it. It was small, but solidly made, with a covered porch and a woodpile stacked with the kind of precision that suggested the person who had stacked it had very particular feelings about the correct way to stack wood. There was a garden to the side, which surprised her. A real vegetable garden with raised beds and careful organization. Not the kind of thing you expected from someone who'd allegedly abandoned domesticity. There was no one there. She stood at the edge of the clearing and called, "Hello? No one there?" Because it seemed like the right thing to do. Nothing moved. She waited. The forest around her made its particular noise, wind, birds, the creak of branches, and she became aware that she was very far from anywhere she knew and entirely reliant on a hand-drawn map made by a 72-year-old woman named Ruth, who had mentioned that some of the distances were approximate. Then a voice came from directly above her. "You're standing in my garden." Olivia looked up. Sitting in the lower branches of a large spruce tree, with the complete ease of someone who sat in trees regularly and found nothing unusual about it, was a man. He was looking down at her with an expression that was not quite a frown and not quite curiosity, but something in between. She looked down. She was, in fact, standing in the garden. Specifically on the edge of what appeared to be a very organized row of carrots. "I'm so sorry," she said, stepping back. "I didn't see the boundary." She said, "There's no boundary," he said, still from the tree. "But the carrots are doing well, and I'd like them to continue." "Right. Yes, of course." She took another step back onto solid, non-agricultural ground. "Are you Ethan Walker?" "Who's asking?" "Olivia Parker. I'm a journalist, with the New York Tribune." Silence. She waited. He climbed down from the tree with the kind of efficiency that suggested it was a well-practiced maneuver. He was taller than she'd realized from the video, probably 6'2", with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and a beard that was full but not untended, and eyes that she could see now were a very particular shade of hazel green. He was wearing the flannel shirt from the video and work pants and boots that made her new hiking boots look like dress shoes, and he was looking at her with an expression she was starting to identify as the expression of a man who had been alone long enough that the arrival of another person required processing time. Alone long enough. "No comment," he said finally. "I haven't asked anything yet." "You will?" "I'd like to, yes. I've come a long way." "That was your decision." This was, she thought, going to be a particular kind of challenge. She made herself smile, not the professional smile she used in interviews with politicians and executives, but the real one. The slightly lopsided one her mother had always said looked like trouble in the best way. "You're right," she said. "It was, and I'd really like 5 minutes. I'll leave whenever you ask me to." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the carrots. Then he looked back at her. "5 minutes," he said. "And don't touch the garden. 5 minutes." Chapter 3. Life in the Mountains. The 5 minutes became 20, and then 40, and somewhere around the 90-minute mark, Olivia realized she had been sitting on his porch steps, while he sat in the porch chair, and they had developed, without either of them quite intending it, something that resembled a conversation. It wasn't a conventional interview. Ethan Walker did not answer questions so much as respond to them, sometimes directly, and sometimes obliquely, and sometimes by asking a question back that redirected the conversation into territory she hadn't anticipated. She was used to interviewing people who wanted to talk. She was less used to interviewing people who seemed to talk, only because silence had been tried and found insufficient. What she was learning, note by note in the recorder she'd eventually asked permission to use, and been granted with a shrug, was this. He had grown up in Billings, the son of a high school shop teacher, and a woman who'd worked 30 years at the same insurance company, and referred to it, apparently without irony, as a good life. He'd gone to the University of Montana because it was close, and had an environmental science program that interested him more than anything else he'd found. He'd joined the Forest Service at 24, because working in the forest seemed, to him, self-evidently the correct thing to do. He'd been good at it. He'd liked it. He'd had a life that looked, from the outside, like a life that was going somewhere. He didn't tell her what had changed. Not that morning. But he talked about the mountain. Changed. He talked about it the way some people talked about a person they loved. Carefully, with attention to specific details, as if getting it wrong would be a kind of disrespect. He talked about the particular quality of the air in October, when the aspens turned and the light changed to something that felt like being inside amber. He talked about the elk he'd watched migrate through the valley below for 3 years running. He talked about the bear. "The bear in the video?" Olivia asked. "Her name's Mabel." Olivia's pen stopped moving. "You named the bear." "I didn't name her. I've been watching her for 4 years. She needed something to call her in my head." He paused. "That probably sounds strange." "I have a cactus named Gerald," Olivia said. "And I talked to him." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the ghost of a smile. The place where a smile might be if circumstances were slightly different. "Does he answer?" "A smile might be if He's a cactus, so no, but he seems engaged." There it was again, that almost smile. She stayed for lunch, which she hadn't planned on, and which he hadn't exactly invited her to, but which happened because he started making a meal while they were talking, and at some point the social physics of the situation made leaving feel ruder than staying. He made bread. Actual bread, from scratch, which he'd apparently started that morning and left to rise, and which he pulled from the oven with the same focused competence he seemed to apply to everything physical. He had a small wood stove in the cabin that heated both the space and the oven, and the cabin itself was warm and smelled like pine and fresh bread, and something else she couldn't name. Leather, maybe, or soil. The particular smell of a place that was fully inhabited by only one person for a long time. The cabin was not what she'd expected for a long time. It was small, yes, and spare in its furnishings, but it was clean and organized, and there were books everywhere. Not shelved, exactly, though there were shelves, piled on the shelves and on the floor and on the windowsills in stacks that seemed deliberate if not catalogued. Philosophy, natural history, wilderness survival, poetry. She spotted Mary Oliver and also a heavily annotated copy of Thoreau that seemed, from a distance, to have been argued with rather than simply read. There were drawings pinned to the walls, good ones. Botanical drawings of plants and careful pencil sketches of animals, done in a style that was observational rather than artistic, but which had become artistic through sheer accumulated attention. "Did you draw these?" she asked. "Yes." "They're really good." He said nothing to that. Set a plate down in front of her, bread, some cheese, pickles he'd apparently made himself, and what turned out to be a very good cold roast chicken, and sat across from her at the small table and ate in the manner of a person who was used to eating in silence and was making a minor adjustment for company. "The fork thing," she said after a while. "May at the diner told me about it. May tells people things. She said you stopped using forks because bears don't." He picked up a piece of cheese. "I stopped, went back. Turns out forks are one of the genuinely good innovations. Bears would probably use them if they had thumbs." Olivia looked at him. "You have a nuanced view of forks." "I have a nuanced view of most things. But not of society in general." He considered this. "I have a nuanced view of society. I just don't particularly want to live in it." She thought about the radio interview, the comment about systems that guaranteed unhappiness. "Why not?" she asked. "That guaranteed unhappiness." He looked at her across the table for a moment, the way he'd looked at her in the clearing when he was still deciding whether to talk to her at all. Then he said, "That's not a 5-minute question." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He stood, collected the plates with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been his own housekeeping staff for years, and took them to the small sink. "If you want to stay and look around," he said, with his back to her, "that's fine. The trail back is straightforward if you follow the markers I put on the trees. Orange blazes. Hard to miss." She stood up. "I'd like to come back," she said. "If that's all right." He didn't turn around. "I'm usually here." She took that as a yes. The walk back down the mountain took 90 minutes, and she spent most of it thinking not about what to write, but about what she'd seen. A man who made bread from scratch and argued with Thoreau and named a bear Mabel and sat in trees because, she now suspected, he simply liked the vantage point. That wasn't what she'd been sent up the mountain to find. She wasn't sure yet what it was, but it was something. Chapter 4. The Rules of Being a Bear. By her 4th visit, she'd come back Wednesday afternoon and again Thursday morning, which meant she'd seen Ethan every day she'd been in Millhaven. She had assembled what she privately called the bear philosophy into something approaching coherence. It had rules. This was the part that surprised her most, though on reflection, it shouldn't have. Ethan Walker was, beneath the flannel and the hermitage and the fish-eating and the tree-sitting, a deeply systematic person. He had approached the project of living like a bear, the way an engineer approached a design problem, rigorously, iteratively, with extensive personal notes. Rigorously, he showed her the notebooks on Thursday, which was an unexpected development she attributed partly to the fact that she'd finally asked the right question. The right question had been, "What does it actually mean to you to live like a bear?" Not philosophically, practically. He'd gotten the notebooks from a shelf without preamble. There were 7 of them, filled in small, careful handwriting, with the kind of marginal notations that suggested active, ongoing thinking rather than settled conclusions. She flipped through with his permission, reading the section headers he'd offered to show her. Sleep. Bears slept when their body required it, woke when they were done, and did not suffer the chronic low-grade sleep deprivation of people who had schedules to meet. Ethan had spent 2 years gradually reshaping his own sleep patterns to follow light rather than clocks. He reported, with the detached interest of a researcher reporting his own experimental data, that he'd slept better in the past 3 years than in all of the preceding decade combined. Eating. Bears ate what was available, ate enough, and did not eat for reasons other than hunger. Ethan grew what he could, hunted and fished for what he couldn't grow, and had worked for years at disentangling eating from every other purpose humans had assigned it: entertainment, comfort, social obligation. The fork thing was a brief experiment, he told her when she pointed to that section. I concluded fairly quickly that the principle didn't require the literal application. That's a very rational conclusion for someone nicknamed the Bear Man. I'm aware of the nickname. I didn't choose it. Territory. Bears had territory and they maintained it, not aggressively, but consistently. Ethan considered the 42 acres his in a way that wasn't primarily about ownership, but about responsibility. He knew every tree, every slope, every water source. He monitored the elk and the deer and the bird populations. He tracked Mabel's movements through the seasons with what had begun as curiosity and become something closer to concerned neighborliness. She had 2 cubs last spring, he said. I only saw them twice, but they were healthy. Social contact. This was the section she found most interesting, and also the most unexpectedly honest. Bears, he'd written, were not social animals in the way humans defined sociality, but they were not entirely solitary either. They coexisted. They tolerated each other near food sources. Mothers maintained profound connections with their young. The myth of the completely solitary bear was not, Ethan had concluded after years of observation, accurate. So, you don't think humans should be solitary? She said. I don't think I should be solitary forever, he said. I think I needed to be for a while. Why? He took the notebook back. Be for a while. Not with any particular force, just with the deliberate movement of someone closing a subject. That's the question you keep coming back to. It's the one that matters most. I know. He set the notebook on the shelf. I'm not ready to answer it yet. She stayed 6 hours that day. They walked part of the property in the afternoon. He showed her the spring where he got water, the section of forest where the elk had come through in October, the place on the eastern slope where he'd found evidence of Mabel's hibernation den. He walked with the particular attention of someone for whom the physical landscape was also a kind of language, stopping occasionally to look at something she might have walked past without noticing. What do you see when you look at that? She asked, when he stopped at the base of a large dead tree that was in the process of being enthusiastically colonized by woodpeckers. He considered the question as if it deserved the consideration. Food chain, he said, the consideration. The tree died because of a beetle infestation, probably 3 years ago. The beetles attracted woodpeckers. The woodpeckers attract hawks. The decomposing wood feeds the soil, which is already producing better growth in the plants around it. Nothing goes to waste. He paused. It's also, he added more quietly, beautiful. Olivia looked at the tree, at the golden late afternoon light hitting the pale dead wood, the red-headed woodpecker that had just landed and was examining them with one suspicious orange eye. The moss that had begun to move in at the base, bright and green against the gray of the bark. Yes, she said. It is. She looked at him rather than the tree when she said it. He didn't notice, or pretended not to. On Friday, she taught her how to start a fire without matches. She did it correctly on the 4th try, which he received with the contained approval of someone who had expected more attempts. On Saturday, they hiked to the top of the eastern ridge and sat for an hour watching a thunderstorm move across the valley below them, distant and spectacular, trailing a curtain of rain that caught the low sun and turned it silver. She was taking almost no notes at this point. This was, professionally speaking, a problem. Personally speaking, she found she couldn't make herself care. That evening, back at the inn, she sat at the small desk in her room and looked at what she'd written and realized it wasn't an article. It was something else. It was the beginning of something she didn't have words for yet, which was an unusual position for a journalist to find herself in. She called her editor. I need more time, she said. Dennis was quiet for a moment. How much more time? A week, maybe 2? Olivia? He's more complicated than the video, Dennis. The story is more complicated. I need to understand it properly before I write it. Another pause. I need to understand. She could hear him rotating in his chair, which he always did when he was thinking. Is this a good story? She thought about the notebooks, about the decomposing tree and the woodpeckers, about the bread and Mabel and the almost smile. Yes, she said. I think it might be a really good story. 1 more week, he said, and I want a draft by the following Monday. She said yes. She hung up. She sat at the window and watched the sky do its Montana thing. Impossible, extravagant, completely uninterested in what she wanted from it. 1 week. It felt, suddenly, like not enough. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Didn't Leave. Ethan Walker was not accustomed to people staying. Most people who found their way up the mountain, lost hikers, the occasional curious local, the journalist who'd come 2 years ago from a Bozeman paper and left after an hour looking faintly disturbed, passed through and went back to wherever they came from, looking faintly disturbed. He had arranged his life, consciously and with great effort, to make it unlikely that anyone would want to stay. The distance was the point. The quiet was the point. The fact that his nearest neighbor was 11 miles away, and they communicated primarily by leaving things on each other's porch was, to Ethan's mind, a feature and not a bug. Olivia Parker, apparently, had not gotten that memo. She came back every morning. Not early. She had the courtesy not to arrive before the day was properly established, but consistently, with her notebook and her recorder, and occasionally with something from May's diner wrapped in paper that she offered him with a directness he found difficult to refuse. By the second week, she knew the trail well enough that she arrived without having to stop and check the blazes, and she'd taken to sitting in the other porch chair. He'd had only one. She'd borrowed it from the inn with Ruth's cheerful permission and carried it up the trail herself, which was either resourceful or alarming depending on your perspective. And reading during the first hour while he worked. He wasn't sure when he'd started looking forward to the sound of her footsteps on the trail. He was certain he shouldn't mention it. She was a good reader. That was the first thing he'd noticed about her, besides the obvious things, which he'd noticed and then set aside to the best of his ability. She read the way bears investigated new things, with complete attention and without performing her own interest for an audience. With complete attention. He'd lent her the annotated Thoreau on the 4th day, half challenge, half genuine interest in her reaction. And she'd had it back to him by the 6th day, with 3 questions written on a post-it note stuck to the front page. The questions were good, better than he'd expected, though he recognized that was unfair. He'd expected her to be less thoughtful because she was a city journalist with a recorder and a notebook, and that was his own bias talking. He'd been told about his biases before. He hadn't always been receptive to the information. You wrote no, but next to this passage, she said on the morning of the 8th day, pointing to a page in the Thoreau. They were on the porch, the morning sun warm enough to sit outside without the added layer. What's the but? He looked at the passage. Thoreau spent 2 years at Walden Pond, and then went back to society. He treated it as an experiment. I respect that, but I think he never fully committed. He left himself an exit. Respect that, and you didn't. I didn't. Do you want one? An exit? He looked out at the tree line. The spruce were dark green against a pale morning sky. That's changed, he said, which was more honest than he'd intended. She didn't push on it. That was the other thing about her. She knew when to let a silence stand. Most people filled silences reflexively, out of discomfort, but she seemed to understand that silence was sometimes the space where the real thing got said. I want to ask you about something, she said after a minute. And you can tell me it's none of my business. That's never stopped you before. That's fair. She set the book on her knee. I found a record, a news story, about an accident, in the Flathead National Forest 6 years ago. A ranger was injured, severely from what I could piece together. 6 years ago. The report mentioned a walker. It was a short piece in the Missoulian, and the name was redacted in the online archive, but not quite thoroughly enough, and the timeline matches when you bought the land. He was quiet for a moment. He'd known, in the abstract, that she would find it eventually. Journalists found things. That was their job, and she was good at her job. "That's not a question," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not. I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm telling you I know it exists, and I'm telling you I haven't written about it, and I'm asking, not for my article, just as a person sitting on a porch. Are you okay?" The question landed differently than he'd expected. People asked him if he was okay occasionally. May, the few Millhaven locals who'd known him long enough to ask, the one old colleague who still sent a card at Christmas, and he answered with the automatic maintenance response. The "I'm fine, yes, everything's good" response. The question didn't usually go anywhere. This one had somewhere to go. He could feel it. "Some days more than others," he said finally. She nodded, didn't say anything, turned the page of the Thoreau. They sat for a while longer, in the particular kind of comfortable silence that Ethan had not experienced with another person in a long time, and which was becoming, if he was honest with himself, something he thought about when she wasn't there. That afternoon, she helped him harvest the carrots. She was, it emerged, utterly without practical outdoor skills, but she was willing to apply effort, and he found her application of effort entertaining. She approached the carrots with a kind of earnest determination that produced mixed results. She pulled several too soon, and one so enthusiastically that she fell backward. And she provided a running commentary throughout that was, he discovered, genuinely funny. "Okay," she said, brushing dirt from her jeans. "I want to understand the philosophy of the garden, because bears don't garden. So where does this fit in the framework? Bears find where the food is and go there. This is where the food is. You made the food be here. Same principle, lower travel cost." She sat back on her heels and looked at him with the expression she got when she thought he was being deliberate about something. "You know you're very logical for someone who lives in a tree." "I sit in trees. I don't live in them? Yet." He almost smiled. He was doing that more, he'd noticed. The almost smiling. It had been a very long time. Chapter 6. Campfires and Confessions. The campfire had been her suggestion. And confessions. She'd mentioned, somewhat wistfully, that she'd never actually sat around a real campfire. Not a suburban backyard fire pit, not a beach bonfire at a rented cottage, but a proper wilderness campfire. And he'd said, without quite planning to, that he built one most evenings in the clearing behind the cabin. "Can I stay?" she'd asked. He'd said yes before he thought about whether he should. That was, he'd realized walking back up the mountain after she'd gone back to the inn that day, the first time she'd asked something he'd said yes to without at least a moment's weighing. Usually, he thought about everything. He'd built his entire life on the premise of deliberate choice, of not doing things by default or out of habit or social expectation, but only because he'd actually decided to. That had been one of the first bear principles, the one that had led to all the others. Bears didn't do things they hadn't decided to do. He'd said yes to the campfire without deciding. They hadn't decided to do. She arrived at dusk, which in early September in Montana meant the sky was a particular orange-rose color that faded through violet at the edges as if the day was bruised. She was wearing a fleece jacket he hadn't seen before, dark blue, and she had her hair down, which was different. She usually had it up in the practical way of a woman who was going to be hiking and working. Down, it was longer than he'd realized, and it moved around her face in the mountain wind, and he made a conscious effort not to notice. He had the fire going by the time she sat across from it. She arranged herself cross-legged on the folded blanket he'd left for her. Because he'd planned for her, he noticed, had thought about what she'd need and provided it without being asked. And she looked at the fire with the expression he'd come to think of as her actually looking expression. The one she got when she wasn't preparing to write something or ask something, but just absorbing. Tell me something true, she said. He looked at her across the fire. What? Something true about yourself. Something I wouldn't find in any record. She picked up a stick and turned it in the fire slowly, not looking at him. I'll go first. I moved to New York because I wanted to be important. Not because I loved journalism, not at first. I wanted the byline and the credibility and the smart friends and the life that looked like the life I was supposed to want. And I got most of it. She paused. And I'm sitting in Montana next to a man who gave all of it up, and I haven't been this happy in years, and I don't know what to do with that. The fire crackled. An owl called somewhere in the dark tree line. I had a partner, he said, before the accident. He hadn't said this out loud in years. It felt strange, the way disused muscles feel strange when you ask something of them. Her name was Caitlin. She was also a ranger. We worked together for 4 years, and then we didn't. She was also a ranger. Olivia looked at him but didn't speak. The accident? He stopped. Started again. We went into a section of the forest that was supposed to be cleared. After a fire, there are procedures, protocols. We'd followed them. But there are things you can't predict. He was looking at the fire. A tree came down. She moved fast enough. I didn't. The silence was complete. Even the owl had stopped. I was in the hospital for 3 months, he said. By the time I was out, she'd put in for a transfer. She came to see me twice while I was recovering. After the second visit, she said she wasn't able to do it anymore. The not knowing, the risk. She was right. The job had risk. We'd both known it. It wasn't her fault. He paused. I understood it. I still understand it. But understanding something and not feeling it are different things. Yes, Olivia said quietly. They are. I came back to the mountains because the mountains didn't require anything from me. I came back. I could be there without performing, without explaining, without having to be fine when I wasn't fine. He picked up his own stick, turned it in his fingers. The bear thing started as a joke, honestly. I was watching Mabel one afternoon and thinking she seemed very unbothered by everything, and I thought, what would it take to be that unbothered? And then it stopped being a joke. When did it stop being a joke? He thought about this. When I realized I'd built something I actually wanted to live in. She was quiet for a while. The fire had settled lower, the initial drama of the flames replaced by a steadier, hotter glow. The sky above them was fully dark now, and the stars were doing their extravagant Montana thing. You're not a bear? She said. No. But you built something worth having. I thought so. You thought so. She looked at him directly. Past tense? He met her eyes across the fire. Past tense? She had a way of looking at him directly that he hadn't gotten used to, even after 10 days. Most people looked at him with a category in mind. Eccentric, odd, interesting, damaged. She seemed to look at him without a category, which was more unnerving, and also, in a way he was still working out, more comfortable. Present tense is complicated, he said. She smiled at that, and the smile was the real one, the lopsided one he'd noticed early on, the one that meant she was genuinely amused and not performing amusement, and it did something to his chest that he declined to analyze. I have to turn in a draft by Monday, she said. That's 4 days. I know. I've written about 600 words, which is not great. What have you written? She looked at the fire. The truth is that I've been here for 10 days, and I've stopped trying to write the article I planned to write, and I don't entirely know what I'm writing instead. A pause. I know what the article was supposed to be. A pause. Man goes viral. Journalist visits, writes charming eccentric in the wilderness piece, readers click and feel warm about humanity. I could write that in a day. I could write it well. But it would leave out everything that matters. He didn't say anything to that. I'm going to need to write something true, she said. And I'm not sure you're going to like it. What does true look like? She looked at him, firelight moving across her face in the particular way fire moved, which was different from any other light, warmer and less certain. It looks like a man who built a good life and is starting to wonder if it's enough. It looks like grief that turned into philosophy, and a philosophy that turned into a home, and maybe a home that's ready to have a door as well as a roof. She paused. Home that's ready to have a door. And it probably looks like a woman who came up a mountain to write a quick piece and found herself genuinely affected by a man who names bears and argues with Thoreau, and once told me the most interesting thing I'd heard in years on a 2-minute radio interview. The fire popped. A spark lifted and died. I listened to that interview, he said, 4 times on the plane, before I came here. Something shifted in his expression. Something that was not quite an almost smile but was related to it. Something deeper and less certain. I know, he said. I'm afraid of what it means that I don't mind you being here. I'm afraid of what it means that I don't want to leave. They sat with that for a moment, the way 2 people sit with something true when they've said it and don't know yet what to do with it. The fire burned down slowly. Neither of them suggested going in. Chapter 7. The Secret Behind the Cabin. There was a second structure on the property, behind the cabin. She found it on the morning of the 11th day, earlier than usual because she'd woken at 5 and couldn't sleep, and had decided that the mountain was better company than the ceiling of her in-room. She'd gotten the fire going herself. Ethan had declared this competence on her 5th try the week before, a declaration that had pleased her more than a professional award she'd won 2 years ago, which was information about herself she was still unpacking, and was sitting on the porch with her coffee when she heard something. It was music. Not loud, not nearby. Coming from somewhere behind the cabin, past the garden, and through the trees on the western side of the property. A trail she hadn't taken, because Ethan hadn't offered it, and she hadn't asked. She set down her coffee and walked toward it. The structure was a workshop, or had been designed as one, and evolved into something else. It was a workshop. It was smaller than the cabin, with large windows on the south side that let in the morning light in long gold panels, and the door was standing open. Inside, Ethan was sitting at a workbench, and what she'd heard wasn't music from a speaker or a radio, but music he was making. He was playing a guitar, a real guitar, acoustic, with the fluency of someone who had played for many years, and he was singing, quietly, just to himself, something she half recognized and then recognized as a song her grandmother had liked, an old folk song she couldn't name but knew by feel. He stopped when he heard her. She stopped in the doorway. I'm sorry, I heard. It's all right. She looked around the workshop. The windows were throwing morning light across a workbench covered in tools, and she now saw, in progress, not just woodworking tools, but carving tools, chisels, gouges, a set of fine instruments she associated with instrument making or model work. A set of fine instruments. On the shelves along the walls were finished pieces, small carved animals, detailed and precise, and furniture joints in various stages of completion, and other things she couldn't immediately identify. You make things, she said. It was unnecessary, obviously, but she needed to say something. Yes. He set the guitar down on a stand. The guitar itself was extraordinary. She could see, even from the doorway, that it was finely made, and she realized with a jolt that it had probably been made here. The guitar also. You made the guitar. Over 3 winters. I was learning woodworking anyway and... He stopped, seemed to decide something. My father played guitar. It seemed like a thing I wanted to know how to do. She came further into the workshop, slowly, reading the room the way she read everything, with attention. The carvings on the shelves were extraordinary. Bears and elk and birds, each one done with the same quality of patient attention she'd noticed in his drawings. Each one done with a mother bear with a cub, an elk mid-stride, a red-tailed hawk in perfect detailed stillness. Who sees these? She asked. I do. No one else? May has a few. Ruth has one. The elk. She asked for that specifically. A few others in town. He paused. Carl at the general store has the bear, the big one on the shelf above the register. He asked me once if I wanted him to sell them. I didn't. She picked up the mother bear carefully, with both hands. It was warm from the morning sun and heavier than she'd expected, the grain of the wood following the shape of the figure in a way that felt intentional. Ethan. This is remarkable. It passes the time. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the expression he sometimes got, the slightly braced expression, like someone who'd expected criticism and was recalibrating for something else. It doesn't just pass the time, it's beautiful and careful, and you made a guitar, a functioning guitar, and you taught yourself to make a guitar and then learned to play it. Learning things is different when you have time. Most people don't make a guitar with their time. He looked away, at the window, at the light. My father died my first year of the Forest Service. We never played together. I kept thinking I'd learn eventually, and then you run out of eventually. She set the carving down gently. The workshop was very quiet, except for the particular outdoor silence of the mountain in morning. Birds, wind in the trees, the distant sound of water somewhere downslope. I think, she said carefully, that you have made a world here that is full of real beauty, and I think you've spent 6 years making sure no one sees it. He said nothing. That's not bear philosophy, she said. Bears don't hide beautiful things. They just exist in them. He turned to look at her. She could see it happening again. The thing she'd noticed at the campfire. The recalibration. The thing behind his eyes that was working through something it wasn't used to working through. You're perceptive, he said. It sounded almost accusatory. Journalist? She reminded him. I'm aware. She leaned against the workbench and crossed her arms, not strategically, but because she needed something to do with her body while she said the next thing. I want to say something, and I want you to know I mean it as I mean it, not as an article thing, not as a story thing. He waited. I think you came up here to heal, and I think you did. And I think the bear philosophy is maybe 60% genuine and 40% a very good excuse not to go back and find out if you're actually healed. She paused. I don't know what going back looks like for you. Maybe it's not New York, obviously. Maybe it's not society as you knew it. Maybe it's not New York, but I think being a person in the world, even a modified world, even a world you've rebuilt, that might be possible, and I think you know that. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she became uncertain whether she'd said too much, pushed too far, crossed the line that careful journalists knew was there, and that she'd clearly, comprehensively, crossed. Then he said, The song I was playing. Yes? My father used to sing it when he was working in the shop. He looked at the guitar. I couldn't play it for 3 years after he died. I could barely listen to it. Now I play it most mornings. He looked back at her. Maybe that's what you mean. Things take the time they take. Yes, she said softly. That's exactly what I mean. She said. He crossed the workshop and picked up the guitar, turned it in his hands with the casual ease of long familiarity, and then, without preamble, played the song again from the beginning, sitting on the stool at the workbench, while the morning light came through the windows, and she sat on an upturned crate and listened. She was definitely not going to be able to write the article she'd been sent to write. She was okay with that. Chapter 8. When the article is published. She wrote the draft in 2 days. Not the article she'd planned, not the charming eccentric in the wilderness piece, not a profile designed to capitalize on 47 million views. She sat at the small desk in her room at Ruth and George's Inn, and she wrote the truth, which was harder than she'd expected, and also, sentence by sentence, the most honest work she'd done in years. She wrote about the bear philosophy, not to mock it, but to trace its actual logic, the real thinking underneath what had looked, on the surface, like eccentricity. She wrote about the notebooks and the garden and the workshop and the guitar. She wrote about Mabel and the cubs, about the decomposing tree and the woodpeckers, about a man who had spent 6 years paying attention to the world he lived in, with a care and thoroughness that most people didn't apply to anything. She was careful about the accident. She didn't use it as an explanation, the tidy psychological backstory that reduced a complex person to a reaction. She mentioned it as a thing that had happened, as part of a life in which multiple things had happened, as context without causation. She wrote about her own experience of being there. This was the part she was least sure about, the part she sent to Dennis with a note saying she'd cut it if he felt it crossed a line. She sent to Dennis. In most journalism, the journalist's interiority was beside the point. But she felt that in this case, the experience of being in Millhaven, of going up the mountain, of sitting with a person who made beautiful things and named bears and had very strong opinions about sleep, that the experience of being changed by something was itself the story. Dennis called her Sunday evening. I'm not going to ask you to cut it, he said. He sounded like himself, but also like a man who had read something he hadn't expected to read. I want to run it at 4,000 words. It'll be on the front page of the magazine section. Okay, she said. This is very good, Olivia. Thank you. Who is this man? She was quiet for a moment. Someone I met, she said. Someone I'm still figuring out. The article ran on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, it had more traffic than anything the Tribune had published in 6 months. By Thursday afternoon, the comments were doing what comments did, but differently than the TikTok comments had done. People were writing paragraphs. People were describing their own lives, the things they'd traded away, the things they'd built in replacement, the question of whether what they'd built was enough. Ethan Walker appeared in the article as himself, recognizable and specific, and readers responded to him the way people responded to things that told the truth about something they'd thought only they felt. She read the comments sitting at May's, which had become her default location for anything that required steady coffee and the company of other people at a safe conversational distance. It's good, May said, looking at the article on her phone. May had gotten someone to print it out as well and had put the printout on the counter, which Olivia found unexpectedly moving. Thank you, May. He's going to hate it. Olivia looked up. Not because it's bad, May said quickly. Olivia looked up. Because it's true, and people are going to read it, and they're going to want to come up the mountain and he's going to feel exposed. She paused. He doesn't like being exposed. Olivia hadn't thought about this in the way May was describing it. She'd thought about whether the article was fair, whether it was accurate, whether it told the truth in a way that was humane. She hadn't thought, or hadn't let herself think, about what it felt like to be its subject, when the subject was a person who had chosen, specifically and deliberately, to be unseen. She drove up to the trailhead. She found him on the eastern ridge, the same place they'd watched the thunderstorm from. He was sitting with his back to her, looking down at the valley, and he had the notebook, one of the bare philosophy notebooks, open on his knee, but he wasn't writing in it. She sat down beside him. He said, "How many people read it?" "About 200,000 so far." He was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. He was quiet. "I should have." "Don't," he said. "Don't apologize for writing something true." He was still looking at the valley. "I read it this morning. May printed it out and left it on my supply list for Thursday." A pause. "She knows me too well." Are you all right?" He turned to look at her then, and she braced herself for something. Anger, or the closed-off expression she'd seen occasionally in the first days when she'd pushed too far. But what she saw was something else, harder to categorize, more vulnerable. "I've been up here for 6 years," he said, not talking about any of it, "and you came up the mountain, and in 2 weeks you wrote it down, and now 200,000 people know it." He paused. "That's a strange feeling." "I know. But it's not." He stopped, looked back at the valley. "I talked to my sister last night, my sister Laura. We haven't spoken in 2 years. She'd read it. She called because she'd read it." Another pause, longer. "She called because she said she'd been waiting for me to be ready." Olivia looked at him. He was still facing the valley, but his jaw had the particular set of someone who was holding something carefully. "What did you say to her?" she asked. "I said maybe I was." He looked at her. The hazel green eyes were direct and very near, and she had the feeling she sometimes got during the best interviews, that the real conversation was finally happening. "I want to ask you something." "Okay." "How long are you staying?" She'd been due back in New York 5 days ago. Dennis had given her the extension, and then another extension, which she'd managed through a combination of professional credibility and the fact that the article was clearly worth it. But the second extension had run out. She had a flight on Saturday. "Saturday?" she said. He nodded, looked at his hands. "I want to ask you something else." "Okay." "Is Saturday the last time, or just the next time?" "Okay." The valley below them was doing something with the afternoon light that she would have taken a photograph of under different circumstances. She looked at it, and then at him, and felt the particular kind of scared that she associated with things that mattered. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I don't know what comes after Saturday." "All right." He said it with a steadiness that she thought cost him something. "That's honest." "I'm trying to be." He looked at her for a moment longer, with the directness she'd never gotten used to, and then he looked back at the valley and said, "There's a Forest Service position in Millhaven. One of the rangers who covers this district retired in June. They haven't filled it." A pause. "I told you that for no particular reason." Olivia stared at him. "You told me that for a very particular reason." He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. "Ethan Walker," she said. "Are you telling me there's a job opening?" "Ethan Walker." "I'm stating a fact about local employment conditions." "As one does." "As one does." She started laughing. She couldn't help it. The laugh came up from somewhere genuine, and the sound of it went out across the ridge in the clear September air. And after a moment, she could see it happening, the decision to let it. He laughed too. His laugh was low and rusty, as if it needed practice. But it was real, absolutely real, and it was the first time she'd heard it, and it did something to her that she was not going to deal with right now, because they were on a cliff edge, and this was not the time. "Saturday?" he said, when they'd stopped. "Saturday," she agreed. They walked back down the mountain together, and she didn't take notes. Chapter 9. Losing What Matters. Most Saturday came in the way difficult days did. Faster than anticipated, without adequate warning, wearing the disguise of an ordinary morning. She woke at 6, which was the mountain time her body had adopted without consulting her. She packed her bag, which took less time than it should have, because she'd lived out of it for 2 weeks with increasing carelessness, leaving things in drawers and on windowsills and discovering, packing, that Millhaven had accumulated in her belongings in small ways. A pine cone she'd picked up on the ridge, a feather Ruth had found and given her because it was too pretty to leave on the ground, a piece of quartz she'd pocketed without thinking on a walk with Ethan along the eastern slope. She put all of it in the bag. Breakfast at May's was quieter than usual. May made her a piece of her specific occasion cake, lemon, dense and perfect, and put it in a box without comment. Lemon, dense. Ruth and George both came to say goodbye, which she hadn't expected, and George shook her hand with both of his and said she was welcome back any time, which meant something because George had said approximately 8 words to her over 2 weeks, and this was clearly an expansion of his emotional vocabulary in her honor. She drove up to the trailhead at 9. He was waiting for her. Not at the cabin. She'd texted the one number she had for him, which he'd given her 2 weeks ago, and which connected to a satellite communicator he used for emergencies, and he'd replied in 3 words, "Top of trail." So he'd come down to her, which was not something he did, which she filed under things to think about later while she hiked the last 100 yards to where he was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face doing the thing it did when he was deciding what to say. "I brought you something," she said, to say. She handed him the book she'd been carrying in her jacket, a copy of Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which she'd ordered from the library in Missoula on her second day in Millhaven because she'd thought of him when she read a passage someone had quoted online, and which had arrived on Wednesday, and which she'd read entirely herself, and which was, she was certain, the book he needed to read next. He looked at it, turned it over, read the back. "It's about paying attention," she said. "In the wilderness, to everything. She stopped. "You'll like it, or you'll argue with it. Either way, you'll like it." He held it in both hands for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Come back," he said. It was the most direct thing he'd said to her, possibly the most direct thing she'd heard from him in 2 weeks of conversations that had been carefully, obliquely circling something. "I will," she said. "I mean, I know what coming back might mean. I know it's complicated. New York, the job, what your life looks like there." He was speaking with the particular care of someone who had rehearsed this and was now realizing the rehearsed version wasn't going to cover the situation. "But I want you to know that what's changed here, in the past 2 weeks, I don't expect it to go back." He paused. "I didn't know I was waiting for something. I thought I was fine. I thought the mountain and Mabel and the notebooks were enough." Another pause. They were enough until they weren't. She reached up and hugged him. She did it before she'd decided to do it, the way you did things that came from somewhere below the decision layer. Decided to do it. He was startled for just a moment. She could feel it, a kind of held breath. And then he put his arms around her, properly, with the full attention he brought to everything physical, and he held her against the cool morning air and the smell of pine and earth and wood smoke, and it was one of those moments that she could already feel becoming permanent, lodged in the particular way of moments that mattered. "I'll come back," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said, "but I needed to say it anyway." She drove down the mountain and got on the plane in Missoula and was back in New York by midnight, and the city received her the way it always did, with complete indifference, which was usually one of the things she liked about it. She stood on the sidewalk outside the airport and looked at the sky, which was the color of nothing in particular, obscured by the ambient light of 8 million people, and she thought about Montana, where the sky was a character and not a background, and she thought about a man with a guitar he'd built himself and a bear named Mabel and a philosophy that was 60% genuine and 40% an excuse that was becoming less necessary. She thought about what she wanted. She went home. She sat in her apartment, which was clean in a way that meant she'd been away from it. No visible signs of life, no warmth, the particular temperature of a room no one had occupied. Gerald the cactus was fine. Cacti were fine. That was the thing about cacti. She opened her laptop. There were 300 emails. There was a message from Dennis about a follow-up assignment. There was a message from her friend Jess asking if she was dead because she'd been unreachable for 2 weeks. From her friend Jess. There were 4 messages from a publicist she'd been meaning to call back. She read none of them. She opened a new document and stared at it for a while, which was how she thought, by staring at blank space and waiting for the shape of things to emerge. The thing was, New York was fine. It was fine in the way a lot of things were fine. Functional, acceptable, neither wonderful nor terrible. The kind of fine that accumulated over years into something that looked very much like a life, but felt, at 3 a.m, like a waiting room. And then she'd gone up a mountain. She closed the laptop. She called Ethan's satellite communicator. He picked up on the 3rd ring, which she knew meant he'd been near it, which meant he'd expected her to call. "I'm back," she said. "I know," he said. "How is it?" She looked around her apartment. The clean counters, the neat shelves, the cactus. Outside, the city, performing itself. "Loud," she said. "City, performing itself." She heard something in his end. Wind, maybe, or the sound of the wood stove settling. "Give it a few days," he said. "It might feel different." "It might," she agreed. She paused. "The Forest Service position, is it still open?" Silence. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm asking a factual question about local employment conditions." Another silence, and then quietly, that rusty, unfamiliar laugh. "Let me find out," he said. She found out through her own channels by the following Tuesday that it was. She had a phone call with the district office on Wednesday that went better than she'd expected, partly because her background in environmental journalism turned out to be genuinely relevant, and partly because it emerged, in the way of small regional networks, that the district supervisor had gone to the University of Montana a year ahead of Ethan Walker and remembered him. She called Dennis on Thursday. He was quiet for a long time after she explained. On Thursday. Long enough that she checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "You're going to Montana," he said finally. "I'm going to Montana. To live. To try living there? Yes. Because of the bear man." "The story is more complicated than that, Dennis." "Olivia, you're quitting your job to move to a mountain because of a man who eats fish with his hands." "I got the Forest Service position. I'll keep writing. Freelance. I'll pitch the Tribune first on everything. You know my work." "That's not the point." "Then what is?" He was quiet again. Then, "Are you happy?" The question landed with unexpected weight. She was sitting on her bed in her New York apartment at 11 o'clock at night, looking at the skyline through the window. And she thought about the ridge and the thunderstorm and the campfire and the workshop and the song her grandmother had liked, played on a guitar built by a man in a flannel shirt who sat in trees. "I think I'm going to be," she said. Shirt who sat in trees. Dennis made a sound that might have been fond and might have been resignation and was probably both. "Send me pieces," he said. "Good ones." "Always," she said. She gave her notice. She called her landlord. She had a long, overdue conversation with Jess that went on for 3 hours and ended with Jess saying she'd always known Olivia was going to do something inconvenient with her life. She donated a significant portion of her belongings to the neighbor down the hall who'd admired her bookcase. She kept the books. She called Ethan that night. "I accepted the position," she said. More silence than usual. She'd learned to read his silences the way you read weather. Different weights and textures, different meanings. This one was the kind that meant he was taking care with something. "When?" he asked finally. "They want me mid-October. I said I could make that work." "That's 3 weeks." "Yes." A pause. "I could drive down to Missoula," he said. "When you land, if you want. Drive down to Missoula. There's a good diner. Not as good as May's, but..." "Ethan." "Come to the airport." Another pause. "All right." She smiled at the ceiling of her apartment. "And I have a question." "Ask." "Gerald needs a place to live. I know you have feelings about indoor plants, but he's a very undemanding cactus, and I think he'd do well on a windowsill in the cabin." Silence. "He doesn't require watering very often," she added. "So actually, he has excellent bear-compatible qualities." "I'll think about it," Ethan said. She could hear the shape of something in his voice, the thing that happened when the almost smile was actually becoming a smile. "That means yes," she said. "It means I'll think about it," he said. It meant yes. Chapter 10. The Bear Chooses Love. October in Montana was everything Ethan had told her it was, and more. October in Montana. She landed in Missoula on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the phone call, and the sky was doing something seasonal and spectacular. The aspen leaves turning in the mountains visible from the airport windows, gold and copper, and the particular orange that existed, she was increasingly convinced, only in this part of the world at this specific time of year. He was at the gate. She hadn't expected the gate. Airports had become complicated in terms of who could meet you where. But there were ways, it turned out, when you were motivated, and Ethan Walker had apparently been motivated. He was standing in the small Missoula airport arrival area, wearing a clean flannel shirt and not wearing the expression she'd come to think of as his default, the one that said he was prepared for things to be difficult. He was wearing something else, something she didn't have a word for yet but intended to figure out. She walked to him, and he said, "You brought the cactus?" She walked to him. She looked down at Gerald, who was sitting in a ventilated carry-on designed per a YouTube video she'd found, specifically for cactus travel. "I told you I was." "I know." He looked at Gerald with the expression he wore when assessing things he was deciding how to feel about. "He's larger than I expected." "Gerald has had a good life in New York. He's grown into himself." "Like you." She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that thing she still didn't have a word for, and she thought she might be able to find a word for it now, standing in the Missoula airport with her bags and her cactus, and the Montana light coming through the windows in long October slants. It looked like relief. It looked like home. It looked like someone who had built a very good life alone and was discovering, carefully, that it was going to be better with company. She put her free hand in his. He looked down at their hands. Then he said, "Mabel has a new cub." "Just one this time?" "Just one." a new cub, smaller than the others were. May's already named her. What's her name? Olivia. She burst out laughing. May named a bear cub after me? She says it's a compliment. I think she's right. He picked up Olivia's larger bag with his free hand, the one she wasn't holding. The cabin has a new window on the south side. For light. I thought, with another person there, it would need more light. She looked at him. He was not looking at her, looking instead at the exit signs, with the studied focus of a man who had said something vulnerable and was managing the aftermath. You've been working on the cabin, she said. I had time. Ethan. You've been getting ready. He said nothing for a moment. They walked toward the exit, through the small airport, past the luggage carousel and the car rental desk, and the automatic doors that opened onto the Montana afternoon. Car rental desk. Outside, the air was cold and clear and smelled like nothing at all, which in Montana meant it smelled like everything. The bear philosophy, he said when they were outside, has a principle about den preparation. When bears find a space that's going to be their home, they work at it. They bring in materials. They make it right. A pause. I may have applied this principle in a domestic context. Olivia stopped walking. He took 2 more steps and then stopped too, and turned back to look at her. She was smiling. The real smile, the lopsided one. You prepared your den for me. I prepared a space for a person who was going to live there, he said, with the dignity of a man who was absolutely not going to admit to finding his own analogy romantic, and also absolutely had to admit to finding his own. She tugged his hand, and he came back to her, back to where she was standing on the sidewalk outside the Missoula airport, with Gerald the cactus and 2 bags and an entirely new life starting in approximately 2 hours' drive of here. I want to see the window, she said. It faces the morning light, he said. I thought you'd want to write in the mornings. I do, she said. I always do. The desk I made fits the corner. She stared at him. You made a desk. You need a place to work. Ethan Walker. What? You made me a desk. He looked at her with the full, direct attention that she'd never gotten used to, and suspected she was never going to get used to, and had fully decided she didn't want to get used to. You're going to need furniture, he said reasonably. I have skills. This is a rational application of skills. It's the most romantic thing anyone has ever done for me. That's a low bar for your previous relationships. That's an extremely good point. Low bar for your previous. He put his arm around her, the way a person did it when they meant it. Properly, warm, and with the ease of someone who had thought about it enough that it no longer required thought. She leaned into it, and they walked to the truck, which was an old blue Ford that had clearly been very cleaned for the occasion, and which had, on the back seat, a folded quilt she recognized from the cabin, which meant he'd brought it for the drive, which meant he'd thought about the drive in advance, which meant she was not going to overthink this. She was, for once in her life, just going to let a thing be what it was. The drive up the mountain took 2.5 hours, the same as the first time, but different in every way that mattered. He told her about the elk migration, which had come through the valley below the cabin in September, 300 animals moving in the particular fluid way of large herds. 300. He told her about the new cub, Olivia the bear, who was apparently already showing personality, according to Ethan, which Olivia chose to take as a compliment. He told her about a conversation he'd had with his sister Laura, who had come to visit him in September, the first time in 4 years, and who had cried, and he had cried, and they had eaten a great deal of bread, and been generally awkward with each other. And it had been, he said, with the measured understatement of someone still learning to name things, good. She told him about the last 3 weeks in New York, about clearing out the apartment and finding, in a box at the back of a closet, a photograph she'd taken on her first day at the Tribune, age 23, standing outside the building with the expression of someone who was certain they were about to have exactly the life they wanted. "Were you?" he asked. "I was going to have a life," she said. "I wasn't certain it was going to be this one." He glanced at her. "I wasn't certain it." The truck was winding up the switchbacks now, the valley opening out below them in the late afternoon light. "Is that all right?" he asked. She looked at him. His profile against the window, the mountain, the aspens going gold in the October air. The hands on the wheel, capable and steady. The same hands that had built a guitar and carved a mother bear and made a desk for someone he'd known for 2 weeks and had apparently been ready for longer than that. "It's better," she said. The cabin was as she'd left it and also completely different. He'd repainted the porch. She could smell the fresh paint. And there were late-season wildflowers in a jar by the front door, which were either very thoughtful or evidence that he was a person who put wildflowers by the door, which she suspected was closer to the truth. The garden had been put to bed for winter, the beds carefully cleared and mulched, and the woodpile was higher than she'd ever seen it. He opened the door for her, and she went inside. The window. The south-facing window was large, much larger than the old one, proper morning light, the kind of light that would come in at 9 o'clock in October and fall across the floor in long, warm panels. And in the corner, under the window, was the desk. It was beautiful. She'd expected it to be good. She knew his work. But it was beautiful in a specific way, designed for a specific person. Not ornate, not showy. Clean lines, smooth surface, a small shelf at the back for books, a drawer that opened easily, a surface just the right width for a laptop and a notebook side by side. The wood was something warm and pale. She'd have to ask him what, and the grain ran in a way that caught the light. She put her hand on the surface. "Maple," he said, from the door. "I had a section from a maple that came down in the spring. I'd been keeping it." She turned around, came down in the spring. He was leaning in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching her with the careful attention she'd come to think of as his primary mode of being in the world. "I don't know what to say," she said. "You don't have to say anything." "That's not a thing I can do." He smiled. The real smile, fully, without the almost, and it rearranged his face into something she hadn't quite seen before, something younger and less defended, and she thought, This is what he looks like when he's not carrying anything." She crossed the room and took his face in her hands, and she kissed him. He was still for half a second, the way he was still with new things, processing, recalibrating. And then he kissed her back, properly, with both hands and his whole attention, and none of the held-back quality she'd been waiting 2 weeks and 3 more weeks to reach through. He kissed her the way he did everything important, fully and without reservation, having decided. When they separated, the cabin was full of the particular golden light of Montana in October at 5 o'clock, and outside the new window, the aspens were doing their best work, and somewhere below them, Mabel was presumably doing very well, and her cub Olivia was discovering the world with appropriate ursine curiosity, and a guitar made of 3 winters sat in a workshop with a mother bear on the shelf above it, and Gerald the cactus was sitting on the porch step where Ethan had set him while carrying in the bags, and the wood stove needed lighting, and none of it required doing right now. "I have one question," she said. "Ask." "The bear philosophy, where does this fit?" He thought about it, genuinely thought, the way he thought about everything, with the full engagement of a person who didn't answer questions they hadn't considered. "There's a principle I've been revising," he said. "Oh?" The original principle was about solitude, about bears being self-sufficient. The original principle about not needing a social structure to be complete. He looked at her. I've been revising it. What does the revision say? Bears who find their person, he said, with the absolute straight-faced gravity of a man who knew exactly what he was saying, are statistically more likely to thrive in the long term. She stared at him. Is that an actual bear fact? I may have extrapolated. From what? From Mabel. He paused. She's been notably calmer this year. I believe the cub is a contributing factor. But also, he paused again. She's been spending time near the eastern slope with a bear I haven't named. He seems... Another pause. She seems to like him. Olivia looked at him for a long moment. At the hazel green eyes and the slight discomfort of a man who had made a romantic statement and was watching himself make it in real time. Ethan Walker, she said. Are you telling me Mabel found a partner and you're citing her as evidence that love is a bear-compatible behavior? A partner and you're citing... He said nothing. Are you using a bear as your emotional support data? I'm presenting available evidence, he said, with great dignity. She covered her face with her hands and laughed until she had to sit down on the bed, which she did, and he sat beside her. And when she finally stopped laughing, she put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the maple desk light of the new window, while outside the aspens turned, and the mountain did its mountain thing, enormous and patient and entirely unbothered. Gerald is going to need to come inside when it gets cold, she said. I know. He does best near a south-facing window. I know. You planned for that too. He said nothing, but his arm tightened around her. That too. Outside, the last light caught the aspens and turned them briefly, extravagantly golden, and the forest took it, the way the forest took everything, the storms and the elk and the bears and the seasons, and now, for the first time in 6 years, the sound of 2 people in the cabin who were both, for entirely different reasons and from entirely different directions, exactly where they meant to be. In town, May texted Ruth. She stayed, Ruth replied. I know. I put the cookies outside the door the first night. That always works. May put her phone away and refilled someone's coffee and smiled at nothing in particular, the way you smiled when things went the right direction. On the eastern slope, Mabel put her nose up and read the air and found it satisfactory. The cub, small and new and already curious about everything, investigated a root and a rock and a patch of late clover, and the world was wide and full of things worth examining. Patch of late clover. Below the ridge, in the cabin with the new south window and the maple desk and the wood stove that Ethan had lit at last, filling the small space with warmth, Olivia Parker opened her notebook. She didn't write an article. She wrote a first line. She was still working on what it was exactly, but it started with, I went up the mountain to find an eccentric. She crossed that out. She tried again. I didn't know I was lonely until I met someone who had already solved it. She crossed that out too. She looked up. Ethan was at the wood stove with his back to her, doing something efficient and domestic with the evening fire, and the light from the stove was warm on the left side of his face, and outside the new window, the last of the October day was going violet at the edges, and she knew the first line eventually, the way you knew things that had been waiting for you to be ready. She wrote, Some things take the time they take, and the time was exactly this long. And somewhere, improbably, a bear named Olivia was learning that the world was large and good. The end.